I want you to picture something for a second. Uh, you open up a newspaper, right? It's the mid-1930s, and somewhere in the editorial section, you spot this cartoon.
A very, very common cartoon for the time.
Exactly. I mean, it's an incredibly ubiquitous image. It ran in hundreds of papers from coast to coast.
Oh, absolutely everywhere.
Yeah. So the drawing is of a workman in overalls. He's slouched over, practically asleep on his feet, leaning his entire bodily weight against the shovel that he is very plainly not using.
Just completely static.
Right. And in the background behind him, there's a construction site, but absolutely nothing is getting done.
Just sitting there.
Yeah. It is the visual embodiment of stagnant laziness. And it became, the absolute visual shorthand for the Works Progress Administration, WPA.
The famous shovel leaner.
The shovel leaner. But here is the paradox we are really unpacking for you on this deep dive today. How does the program that built the literal foundation of modern America, I mean, the schools, the sewers, the bridges, the roads you and I still drive on today, how does that simultaneously become a national punchline for slow, useless make work?
Right. It's a massive contradiction. And to understand that massive disconnect between the physical reality of what was actually built and the popular perception of the people building it, well, we have to look at the WPA not just as a construction initiative.
Okay, so what was it then?
It was a political entity under constant siege. I mean, from the day it opened its doors in 1935, it made incredibly powerful enemies.
And so the way we are going to navigate this history for you today is by treating it as sort of a high-stakes courtroom debate.
I like that framing.
Yeah, we are putting the WPA on trial, basically. We're examining the most potent charges leveled by its critics and pairing each of those attacks with the WPA's defense.
We're going to look at the historical arguments from all sides here. The conservative press, the left-wing labor unions, the business community, and the Roosevelt administration itself.
Exactly. And just to be clear, we're acting as impartial guides through the source material. We just want to figure out how a wildly popular program survives some enemies, but completely fails to survive others.
It's fascinating when you look at the ledger of what worked and what didn't.
It really is. So the docket today has 4 major charges. You've got the Boondoggle charge, the political patronage charge, the economic disruption charge, and finally a culture war charge that proved fatal to the Federal Theater Project.
The Big Four.
The Big Four. So let's open with that Chevaliner cartoon. Exhibit A. The prosecution's first massive attack centers on one specific word, and that word is boondoggle.
Which is such a weird word when you think about it. The etymology of boondoggle is actually quite mundane. It predates the New Deal entirely.
Wait, really? I always thought it was invented for the WPA.
Oh, no. It originated in scouting and craft contexts to describe, the weaving of lanyards or making little trinkets out of leather scraps.
Okay, so like summer camp stuff.
Exactly. But in the 1930s, the conservative press weaponized the term. It entered wide American usage as political slang for useless government-funded make work.
Ah, I see.
Yeah, they used it to describe labor that produces absolutely nothing of value, yet drains the public treasury to pay a wage.
And the New York Sun practically institutionalized the word, right?
Absolutely.
They ran this recurring daily feature called Today's Boondoggle every single day. And they would highlight a different WPA project, usually something small or highly obscure, and just hold it up to public ridicule.
They were relentless.
They really were. I mean, they weren't just writing about roads. They were finding projects where the WPA was paying people to catalog the history of the safety pin.
Yeah.
Or map ancient burying grounds. Or literally teach people how to play ping pong in a public park.
Which sounds ridiculous out of context.
It does. The sheer volume of these highly specific, odd jobs made the WPA look like an asylum of padded work.
Right.
But as the jury looking at this historical evidence, we have to ask about the mechanism behind this. Was there a kernel of truth to the idea that the WPA was inherently inefficient?
Well, yes. The critics definitely had genuine ammunition. But here's the key. The inefficiency wasn't an accident. It was baked into the program's primary mandate.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning the overarching goal of the WPA was employment. It was designed to pull human beings out of breadlines and put them to work.
Right.
Because of that mandate, the WPA routinely and deliberately chose slower, labor-intensive methods over efficient, mechanized ones.
Okay, so give me an example of what that looked like on the ground.
Sure. So if the goal is digging a massive trench for a new municipal sewer line, a private company brings in a steam shovel.
Makes sense.
One guy operates it, the trench is dug in a week, and it's very cost-effective.
Yeah.
But the WPA would look at that same trench, leave the steam shovel parked, and hand out 50 manual shovels to 50 desperate men. Wow.
Which meant the project took 3 times as long and looked incredibly primitive. But the administration's goal was, pay 50 men a wage so their families don't starve this month.
Right. But if you are a business-minded critic, looking at that from the outside, watching 50 men do the work of one machine, the inefficiency is glaring.
It looks insane to them.
Right. You point at those men and say, look at this gross waste of taxpayer money. Look at this padded make work. So how did Harry Hopkins, he was WPA administrator, right?
He was, yeah.
How did he justify that to a public that valued industrial efficiency so highly?
Well, Hopkins had a very specific governing logic.
Yeah.
He was defending work relief against 2 sets of critics simultaneously. You had the ones screaming about boondoggles and the ones who just wanted the government to hand out a cheaper dole.
Like just direct cash handouts.
Exactly. I mean, it would have been mathematically cheaper for the government to just mail people checks, but Hopkins argued that direct handouts sapped human dignity.
He genuinely believed physical labor preserved the spirit and the skills of the American worker. His famous defense, which is heavily quoted, was, "People don't eat in the long run. They eat every day."
That's a great quote. So the defense rests on the dignity of labor, but that's a pretty abstract concept.
So very abstract.
You can't really put human dignity in a newspaper editorial to fight back against a cartoon of a guy leaning on a shovel. The WPA needed a tangible counterargument.
Which brings us to their first major defensive strategy, visible output.
Right.
The WPA leaned heavily into building things that everyday citizens could see, touch, and use in their own immediate neighborhoods. They fought a conceptual attack with a physical reality.
That's smart.
It was very smart. If a critic calls your work a boondoggle, but you just paved the main street in a citizen's hometown or built the high school their children attend, the physical output becomes an unassailable defense.
You can't argue with the bridge. You literally just drove over to get to work.
Exactly. You can call it a boondoggle all you want, but the bridge is right there.
But the strategy of visible output ran into a massive structural wall. And this is where the mechanics of the 1930s economy become vital for you to understand if you really want to grasp this.
Yeah, this is a crucial piece of the puzzle.
There was a strict legal constraint placed on the WPA. They were legally barred from undertaking any projects that private businesses could and would bid on.
Right, because the Roosevelt administration was terrified of suffocating the private sector. The whole point of the New Deal was to revive the private economy, so the government couldn't just monopolize all the profitable construction work.
I was trying to come up with a mechanism-driven analogy for how bizarre this constraint actually was.
Let's hear it.
Okay, so it's like a new public hospital opening up in a town to deal with a massive plague, right?
Cool.
But the local private doctors lobby the government to make sure this new public hospital is only allowed to treat patients who are already legally dead.
Oh, wow.
Right. And then those same private doctors walk past the public hospital every single day, point at the mortality rates, and write articles mocking the hospital for failing to cure anyone. The rules guaranteed they would look incompetent.
That captures the irony perfectly. I mean, the non-compete rule pushed the WPA completely out of the most straightforward, commercially viable construction projects.
They were blocked from the easy stuff.
Exactly. So they were forced into a very specific niche, which was the public good. They had to invent projects that private contractors generally ignored because there was no profit motive whatsoever.
Which explains the ping pong lessons and the safety pin cataloging.
It explains all of it. Building local libraries, organizing historical archives, painting murals in post offices, municipal repair work, expanding rural parks.
All the stuff that doesn't make money.
Exactly. And the unintended effect of this constraint was twofold. First, it concentrated WPA work precisely where the output was civic and highly visible, which was a safe zone from the competition complaint. But secondly, it absolutely fueled the make work critique. Organizing archives or painting a mural doesn't look like real industrial construction to a critic looking for efficiency.
It looks like a boondoggle.
It does. The very rule designed to keep the WPA out of trouble guaranteed that a large portion of its work would look completely marginal to the average taxpayer.
So the verdict on Exhibit A, the boondoggle charge, is really a split decision. I mean, the inefficiency was real, but it was a deliberate feature, not a bug. It was mandated by the rules of the era.
It was the only way they could operate.
And the WPA largely survived this attack because the sheer volume of concrete they poured just overwhelmed the mockery of the New York Sun.
Concrete is a very good defense.
It is. But pouring concrete saves you from being called lazy. Concrete doesn't vote.
Ah.
And as we head into the 1936 election, the sheer mass of human beings on the WPA payroll suddenly looked less like a relief effort and more like a terrifying taxpayer-funded political army.
Now we are moving from the physical infrastructure to the raw mechanics of political power. Exhibit B.
The vote buying and patronage charge.
Exactly. And to set the scene for this charge, we have to look at the political landscape of 1936. Franklin Delano Roosevelt wins re-election in an absolute crushing landslide.
I mean, it was a massive mandate.
Unprecedented. And in the wake of that, the opposition, meaning both Republicans and conservative Democrats, are just terrified by the scale of the WPA.
Because you have millions of workers whose literal physical survival, their ability to buy groceries that week, depends entirely on the administration currently in power.
That is a terrifying amount of leverage.
It really is. So prominent critics, like Senator Josiah Bailey of North Carolina, they step up and argue that the WPA isn't a relief program at all. They say it's a built-in, federally funded get-out-the-vote operation.
The accusation was basically that the government was holding workers' paychecks hostage.
Yeah.
The implied or sometimes explicit threat was, vote for us or the relief money dries up and you lose your job.
And we have to acknowledge that this charge was highly potent because the mechanism for abuse already existed at the ground level.
Let's unpack how that coercion actually worked in practice, because the WPA was a federal program, right?
Right.
But the people handing out the jobs weren't federal bureaucrats shipped in from Washington.
No. The local administration ran through existing entrenched political channels. Mayors, local party bosses, ward captains. These were the men who often controlled the intake process.
They were the gatekeepers.
Exactly. They had a massive hand in deciding who got a WPA job ticket and who didn't.
So imagine a guy in Chicago standing in line for a ditch-digging job.
Okay.
He gets to the front of the line, and the local ward boss is sitting at the desk. That boss knows exactly what precinct this guy lives in.
He knows everything about him.
Right, so it doesn't take much imagination to see the ward boss sliding the work ticket across the desk and saying, "Make sure I see you at the rally on Thursday."
Or demanding a subtle kickback from the weekly paycheck to fund the local party machine.
Exactly. That is the very definition of political patronage.
The potential for systemic abuse was just glaring. And the Roosevelt administration realized they were facing a massive crisis of optics, if not reality. They needed a defense.
But like we said, you can't build a bridge to prove you aren't buying votes.
No, you cannot.
The mitigation this time had to be statutory. It required a legislative fix.
Which brings us to the Hatch Act of 1939. This was sponsored by Senator Carl Hatch, who was a Democrat from New Mexico. And the official title of the law was an act to prevent pernicious political activities.
The Hatch Act, which was enforced by the Civil Service Commission, laid down a hard legal line. It explicitly barred federal employees from taking an active part in political management or political campaigns.
And crucially, it deliberately included relief workers in this definition.
Yes, so no campaigning on the clock.
No wearing a political button while you're pouring the concrete for the new sewer?
Exactly. But the core of the act strictly prohibited coercing these workers into political activity as a condition of keeping their jobs. It made it a federal crime to threaten a WPA worker's livelihood to secure their vote or a campaign donation. Congress was trying to answer the vote-buying charge by making the mechanics of it illegal.
I have to push back here, though, on the logic of this defense.
Okay, push back.
I hear that the Hatch Act made it illegal. But does passing a piece of paper really stop a giant federal payroll from inherently benefiting the party in charge?
It's a fair question.
It feels like putting a legislative Band-Aid on a structural hemorrhage. Like if I am a WPA worker and the Roosevelt administration is the one signing the check that keeps a roof over my head, I don't need a local ward boss to coerce me into voting for them.
You're going to do it anyway.
I'm going to do it out of sheer self-preservation.
And your pushback is completely historically valid. It mirrors the exact frustration of the critics at the time.
Right.
The even-handed reading of the Hatch Act is that it was a compromise that treated the acute symptoms of the problem. It successfully addressed the direct, overt coercion.
The physical threats.
Right, the mandatory campaign kickbacks. It cleaned up the optics.
It stopped the ward boss from shaking the guy down at the desk.
Exactly. But it could not resolve the historical debate over how much subtle abuse still occurred. nor could it erase the political reality of federal payrolls.
You just can't legislate that away.
No, you cannot legislate away the structural fact that creating millions of jobs makes an administration incredibly popular with the people holding those jobs.
Right.
The Hatch Act was the strongest defense the WPA could muster, but it never fully silenced the charge that the program was, at its core, a political instrument.
Okay, so we've survived the Boondoggle charge with physical evidence. We've managed the vote-buying charge with a new law. But Exhibit C, the third major attack on the docket, is where the situation becomes nearly impossible.
Because there was no separate mitigation for this one.
No. We are looking at the security wage squeeze.
And if the Hatch Act was about the political optics of the workforce, this charge is about the brutal economic reality of their paychecks. Deciding how much to pay millions of people during the Great Depression was a terrifying macroeconomic tightrope walk.
Before we explain the tightrope, let's just unpack the economic terror of the 1930s labor market for a second. Why was setting a wage so dangerous?
Because during the Depression, the labor market had completely collapsed.
Right.
If you have a massive pool of desperate unemployed men, the value of labor plummets to near zero. People will work for almost nothing just to survive.
It's basic supply and demand, just at a horrific scale.
Exactly. So if the government steps in and becomes the largest employer in the country, the wage they set instantly becomes the anchor for the entire national economy.
Which brings us to the WPA's concept of the security wage. Explain the math behind this for us.
The security wage was a deliberate, incredibly fragile compromise. The administration decided that WPA workers had to be paid more than they would receive on a straight relief dole.
Okay.
So if a dole check was, say, $15 a month, the WPA might pay $50. This tied back to Hopkins' belief in rewarding actual labor.
The dignity of work.
Right. However, they simultaneously mandated that the security wage must be deliberately lower than the prevailing private sector rates and lower than union rates.
Oh, wow.
So if a private carpenter made $80 a month, the WPA carpenter could only make $50.
And this goes right back to the fear of suffocating the private sector.
Yes. The government did not want to steal workers away from private businesses by offering better pay. They wanted the WPA to be a safety net, not a permanent career destination.
So the psychological intent was, you work here to survive, but the second a private sector job opens up, you take it because it pays more.
That was the exact logic.
It sounds like a perfectly balanced, logical compromise in a textbook, but in reality, on the ground, it made absolutely everyone furious.
It really did.
The WPA faced a dual prosecution here from which ends of the political spectrum. Let's look at those historical arguments, starting with the business critique on the right.
So the business and conservative critique argued that even at a deliberately below market rate, this massive public wage was a disaster. They argued it drew workers away from the private sector anyway, simply because a government job felt vastly more secure than a private job during a depression. Hence the name security wage.
I see.
Businesses complained that this massive pool of government money artificially propped up labor costs, preventing the market from correcting itself.
And Senator Bailey was vehemently arguing that it sapped the American work ethic. The conservative fear was that men would become dependent on this disguised dole rather than aggressively seeking out private employment.
That was the pressure from the right. But the pressure from the left was arguably even more intense. The unions were furious, but for the exact opposite reason.
Because if the government is paying $50 a month for carpentry, it totally undercuts the union demanding $80.
Precisely. The unions looked at millions of government workers accepting sub-prevailing wages and saw a massive threat to their very existence.
Right, because they had fought literal blood-in-the-streets battles for decades to establish minimum wage standards.
Exactly. And now the federal government was legally normalizing the practice of paying men less than those hard-fought standards.
That is wild.
The unions feared that this massive pool of cheap public labor would drag down the going rate for everyone. I mean, there were literal strikes and protests organized by unions against WPA projects because the wages were too low.
It's just an impossible situation. The psychological weight on a WPA worker must have been immense.
Well, unbearable, really.
You're bringing home $50 a month to feed your kids, which is barely enough to survive. Yeah. And when you show up to the job site, union guys are screaming at you for driving their wages down. Yeah. Business owners are writing editorials calling you a lazy parasite, driving labor costs up.
And this is where the WPA's defense is completely unique compared to the other charges we've looked at.
How so?
Well, with the Boondoggle charge, they built roads. With the patronage charge, they passed the Hatch Act. With the wage critique, there was no separate mitigation. The wage itself was the mitigation.
The compromise was the only defense they had.
The fact that it drew such heavy fire from both sides is the historical proof of just how impossibly narrow the needle's eye was. They were trying to provide mass relief without completely distorting the American labor market.
And the price of threading that needle was universal, relentless criticism.
It was.
So up to this point, the WPA has proven remarkably resilient. It survived attacks on its efficiency with the strategy of visible output. It survived attacks on its politics with the Hatch Act. It survived economic attacks through sheer, stubborn compromise.
Right.
But now, we arrive at the final charge on the docket. This is the kill shot. This is the one attack the program could not blunt.
We are moving out of economics and infrastructure and stepping into a pure culture war. We need to examine Federal One, the Dies Committee, and the complete destruction of the Federal Theater Project.
And to understand why this attack was fatal when all the others failed, we have to look closely at the target.
Yes, the context is everything here.
Federal One was the cultural arm of the WPA. It employed artists, writers, musicians, and actors. And the most prominent and eventually most controversial unit was the Federal Theater Project, or the FTP.
Which was directed by Hallie Flanagan. She was a brilliantly innovative theater scholar from Vassar College, and Flanagan built something entirely unprecedented in American history. The FTP wasn't just a small, elite program in New York. It had a massive national reach.
How big are we talking?
It provided free or incredibly cheap theater in 40 states. It brought live performances to millions of Americans who had never seen a play in their lives.
It was also groundbreaking in its social structure, right?
Yeah.
It featured integrated casts at a time when that was deeply controversial and actively resisted in many parts of the country.
Absolutely. But the real friction came from the content of the plays themselves. The FTP was famous for a format called the living newspaper.
Let's dive into what that actually looked like on stage.
A living newspaper was essentially a topical, documentary-style drama. They would take the pressing social and economic issues of the day and dramatize them.
Give me an example.
For example, they produced a play called One Third of a Nation, which was about the massive crisis of slum housing and poverty. They produced AAA Plowed Under, which tackled the agricultural crisis and the plight of farmers.
So they were taking the headlines that people were reading in the paper, putting actors on a stage, and showing the human cost of these policies.
Exactly.
It's a powerful concept.
Yeah.
But by definition, these plays had a viewpoint. They're often advocated heavily for social reform. I mean, some supporters proudly describe the FTP's work as propaganda for democracy.
But if you are a conservative critic looking for subversion, propaganda for democracy can very easily be spun into just propaganda.
Right.
The content of the Federal Theater Project, the focus on poverty, the integrated casts, the progressive director, it all made it an irresistible target.
And the people who painted the target on them were the members of a newly formed congressional committee. In 1938, the House of Representatives establishes the Special Committee on Un-American Activities.
This is the precursor to the infamous McCarthy-era hearings of the 1950s.
Right.
It was led by a Texas Democrat named Martin Dies Jr., so it was commonly known as the Dies Committee.
And what was their actual mandate?
The committee's mandate was to probe alleged communist influence and subversion in the United States, and they zeroed in almost immediately on the WPA arts projects, with a laser focus on the theater project.
Why the obsession with the arts over the infrastructure? I mean, there were millions of guys digging ditches, but the committee focused on a few thousand actors.
Because the arts deal in ideas. A ditch doesn't threaten the political order. A play about slumlords and striking workers does. The Dies Committee saw the progressive themes of the living newspapers, and they launched a highly publicized campaign to paint the FTP as a hotbed of communist sympathizers using federal funds to brainwash the American public.
Which all builds to a climax that is pure courtroom drama. Let's look at the events of December 6, 1938.
On that day, Hallie Flanagan is summoned to testify before the Dies Committee in Washington.
Okay.
She is there to defend her program, her actors, and the very concept of free public art before a congressional committee that is actively hunting for subversives.
The atmosphere in that room must have been incredibly tense. But there is one specific exchange from this hearing that historians point to as the definitive, almost absurd emblem of this entire culture war. The Christopher Marlowe moment.
It perfectly encapsulates how suspicion wildly outran actual knowledge during these hearings.
Walk us through it.
So during the questioning, a committee member, Representative Joe Starnes of Alabama, is interrogating Flanagan about an article she had written years prior, trying to root out communist sympathies.
Right.
He is reading her words back to her, and he comes across a reference she made to Christopher Marlowe. He looks at her and asks, point blank, "You are quoting from this Marlowe. Is he a communist?"
Let's pause to establish for the listener who might be rusty on their 16th century English literature. Christopher Marlowe was a famous Elizabethan playwright.
Right.
He wrote Dr. Faustus. He was a contemporary of William Shakespeare. He had been dead for over 300 years by the time of this hearing.
And while the exact transcript wording sometimes varies slightly in historical retellings, the core fact of the exchange is undeniable.
A U.S. congressman, in his absolute zeal to uncover subversion, accused a long-dead Renaissance playwright of being a Soviet sympathizer, simply because his name appeared in a progressive director's essay.
It's a moment of dark comedy, really.
It is. But the underlying reality is terrifying. It proved that the committee didn't care about the facts. They cared about the optics of rooting out un-Americanism.
Exactly. Flanagan gave a highly articulate defense of her program, pointing out the immense popularity of the plays and the sheer number of people they employed. But the verdict was already decided before she ever sat down.
The suspicion itself was enough to condemn them.
The hammer finally comes down on June 30th, 1939. Congress terminates the Federal Theater Project outright. They completely defund it. It is the only unit of Federal One to be killed by name.
The other arts projects, art, writing, music, they survived, but they were severely crippled.
Very much so.
The Relief Act for the coming year pushed them down to require state and local sponsorship, which essentially ended the grand national experiment of federal arts funding.
And this is the profound realization of this entire history, the grand synthesis of our courtroom debate. This was not a loss based on economic inefficiency.
Right.
It wasn't a loss based on patronage or vote buying. This was a pure culture war loss. It exposed the ultimate fatal limit of the WPA's defenses.
Let's connect this back to Exhibit A. The visible output strategy worked perfectly for the construction projects.
Yeah.
It saved them from the boondoggle charge because a road is an undeniable physical fact.
You can't argue with it.
But here is the stark difference. A road doesn't speak. A sewer system doesn't have a political opinion. But art, by its very design, says something. It has a voice.
And the subjective nature of art made it completely defenseless against ideological panic.
You can prove a bridge is fundamentally sound by driving a truck over it.
Right.
You cannot prove a play is loyal to the satisfaction of a committee hunting for disloyalty. No amount of good, solid concrete, and no amount of clean political activity laws like the Hatch Act can shield a program from charges of subversion when those charges are aimed at its cultural output.
It's a completely different battlefield.
So we've watched the WPA survive the infrastructure battles and lose the culture war. Let's look at the battered agency that walked out of those 1939 fights. What happens in the aftermath of these hearings?
Well, the agency is fundamentally altered, both structurally and psychologically. In 1939, the government undergoes a major reorganization.
Sure.
The WPA is folded into the newly created Federal Works Agency. It is stripped of its independent cabinet-level standing and buried deeper in the bureaucracy.
And there is a symbolic demotion in its very name, isn't there?
Yes, there is. It is rechristened the Work Projects Administration. They lose that sweeping, ambitious, optimistic word, progress, and it is replaced with the narrower administrative word, projects.
That's a huge shift.
It is a symbolic shrinking of the agency's soul. In the years following 1939, the program slowly bled out. It faced rising charges of mismanagement accompanied by steadily reduced congressional appropriations.
Just a slow decline.
Right, long before the massive industrial boom of World War II finally solved the unemployment crisis and rendered the WPA moot. The opponents had successfully tightened the noose.
So for you, the learner trying to make sense of this, what is the ultimate takeaway here about managing the public perception of large federal programs?
Well, if we review the ledger, the strongest defense of the WPA is that it proved a massive, highly popular program can survive bruising charges of economic inefficiency through the undeniable reality of visible output.
Right, the concrete.
It can survive charges of political patronage through legislative compromise, like the Hatch Act. It can even survive intense anger from both business and labor over wage scales by simply holding the line on a fragile compromise.
But the strongest critique, the one that ultimately crippled part of the program, shows that ideological culture wars are an entirely different beast.
Completely different.
The WPA could successfully justify the grueling physical labor of millions of men building roads, but it could not justify the intellectual labor of a few thousand actors putting on a play that asks difficult questions about society.
It's a sobering thought about what kinds of government actions we accept and what kinds we fear.
It really is.
Right.
And we are going to wrap up our historical journey here, but I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over on your own. We spent this time talking about how Harry Hopkins and the WPA struggled so mightily to justify human labor against charges of inefficiency and make work.
Right. The critics wanted the cheapest, fastest way possible, even if it meant using machines instead of men.
It was a fundamental tension between preserving human dignity and demanding economic efficiency. Well, right now, today, we are facing the rapid, sweeping automation of labor through artificial intelligence and advanced robotics.
It's happening right now.
If a machine can truly do the work perfectly, faster, and cheaper, how do we, as a society today, value the human dignity of work? How do we solve the very problem the WPA was trying to solve when the tools are finally truly taken out of our hands?
It is the exact same question, just in a different century.
It really is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the historical sources. We love taking these journeys with you, unpacking the past to better understand the mechanics of the present. Keep asking questions, keep looking at the sources, and we will catch you on the next one.